Hey, fifth graders. Welcome back to another excerpt from Nowhere Boy. When we left off, Oscar and Max, they worked together. They forged the documents at the commune where Oscar's mom works. And as they're walking out, Inspector Fontaine was right there, and they ran into him, and he's like, "Hey, boys, play outside." So that was close. Let's see what happens. But I feel like, now he's on their radar, like he's seen them. So chapter 33. The documents were perfect, almost foolproof. Oscar had done a phenomenal job, better than even a professional forger. But Ahmed knew that none of this mattered if the School of Happiness didn't have a spot for him. I wonder if in a public school, if you live in the area, they have to find a spot for you. So I don't know if that's different in Belgium. That's interesting to note. On the Thursday before the start of the holiday break, Ahmed slipped over the garden wall and onto the street. He crossed the big avenue with the American name, Brand Whitlock, Max had told him, for the U.S. ambassador who had arranged food drops during the First World War, and walked to Oscar's apartment. I think somebody should do some research on him and add it to the slide. Brand Whitlock, okay? Challenge. He knew and walked to Oscar's apartment building. He knew he was at the right apartment when he saw Farah's shoes lined up outside. He knocked on the door and Max answered. Good timing, we just got here. Bonjour, Ahmed, came Farah's voice from inside. No Oscar, Mom? Ahmed asked as he pulled off his sneakers. I told you she'd come home after 5, Oscar hollered in English from inside. He's just nervous, Max whispered. Ahmed understood. He lined up his shoes next to Farah's, then followed Max down the hall to a combined dining living area. Photos of a man Ahmed presumed to be Oscar's father decorated every wall. He was a big man like Ahmed's own dad, and he looked too strong to no longer be alive. Oh, that's sad. Oscar disappeared into the kitchen, and Ahmed sat down across from Farah, who was perched on a love seat staring at a mobile phone. As Oscar awkwardly played host, dumping 4 bottles of orange Fanta on the coffee table, Ahmed noticed Farah's lips moving silently. You okay? Max asked her in French, so simple that even Ahmed understood. It's getting better. She nodded, then pointing to a piece of paper that listed the members of Ahmed's household. Mother name? Reem Nasser? She asked in English. Oui? Yes? It had been wise of Max to use his mother and sister's real names. Ahmed wouldn't have to remember made-up ones, but he still winced to hear his mother's name spoken out loud. Oui, Reem. Farah said something to Max in French. She said, maybe it's too difficult for you to listen, Max translated. No, Ahmed protested. I want to be here. But as Max presumably translated this for Farah, Ahmed continued to peer at the document. It was like a glimpse into an alternate reality in which the bomb had never struck, and his mother and sisters had made it to Belgium with him. Fifth graders, I can't imagine that anguish, losing so many members of your family. He wished he could add his grandfather's and father's names, make his ink and paper family complete. But then he shook off the fantasy. The document was counterfeit in the worst way. There was no alternate reality. There was only this one. He tried to follow the conversation Max and Oscar were having with Farah. They seemed to be coaching her on what she should say, but she waved them off and picked up the phone. Ahmed noticed her finger trembling as she typed in the first few numbers. Ahmed turned to Max. Please translate her. She need not do this. I am not want to harm her honor. Her honor, Oscar cut in. Is this some crazy Muslim talk? Fifth graders, why does he say this stuff? He's trying to be respectful and understanding and not put her in a bad spot. Ugh, Oscar, he's done some great things, but now he's driving me nuts. Max's eyes shifted uneasily. He just means, but Oscar wouldn't let him finish, that he does not want her to get in trouble, but with us it's okay. I want no one to have trouble, Ahmed interjected. Farah had stopped punching in numbers. Oscar and Max switched into French, and Ahmed was briefly left out of the conversation. He wished he could explain how, at least back home in Aleppo, a girl Farah's age wasn't supposed to meet with boys outside her family by herself. Farah glared at Oscar, then turned to Max and with a knowing glance spoke firmly. Max translated, "You are kind, Ahmed, to worry about me. But where is my honor if I do not help a brother?" I love her. Let me read that again. That is amazing. But where is my honor if I do not help a brother? She's right. It had been a long time since anyone had called him a brother, since Jasmine and Nori were alive. Ahmed's voice caught. Merci. Farah narrowed her eyes and finished typing in the number. As he watched her, Ahmed recalled a passage from the Quran. Allah knows well the mischief maker from the reformer. They weren't really doing anything wrong. She lifted the phone to her ear. A silent moment passed, then another. Even Oscar leaned in anxiously. Maybe Secretary no there, Ahmed finally said. Oscar looked at his watch. She should be. Bonjour, madame. Farah's hand shot up to silence them. Ahmed could barely breathe. Max and Oscar seemed equally frozen. Oh, she's calling the school. Je m'appelle Reem Nasser. My name is Reem Nasser. Farah's voice sounded different, lower and more nasal. It shook slightly, but in a way that Ahmed hoped made her seem sympathetic. Ahmed could only understand a few words and phrases of what she said next. Mon fils, my son. Il s'appelle Ahmed. His name is Ahmed. 10 Juillet 2001, July 10th, 2001, his birthday. His accent sounded like an Arabic one, although her accent sounded like an Arabic one, although not particularly Syrian. But how many Belgians would be able to tell the difference? In the pause that followed, Ahmed felt almost physically ill. No, madame, Farah said. Then she began to argue. Ahmed couldn't understand what she was saying except for the phrase "Disier" from Syria. He looked frantically over at Oscar. The secretary thinks you are too old for class 6, Oscar whispered, but Farah is telling her that you did not go to school for 3 years. He stopped and pointed to Farah, whose voice had softened. Oui, madame. Farah reached out for the whole household document in his ID. The secretary was clearly asking about his immigration status, whether he had Belgian residency. D'accord, madame, merci. Another silence followed. Farah held the phone away and mouthed something in French to Max and Oscar. She's going to talk to the principal and check for open spots, Max whispered in English. Ahmed curled himself into a ball, holding his knees against his chest. He closed his eyes and listened to Max tapping his finger against an empty Fanta bottle. The minutes seemed to drag on. At last he heard Farah's voice. Merci, madame. Je comprends. Au revoir, madame. I understand. Au revoir. Goodbye. She hit a button, put down the phone, and smiled at Ahmed. Was it good news, or was she smiling to soften the blow? He was too afraid to find out. Max scooted to the end of his chair. And? Say, he's starting to say things in French without even thinking about it. Tu peux y aller. Oh, my French is bad, Farah said quietly, still addressing Ahmed. Ahmed was sure he hadn't heard her properly, that she was saying he couldn't go, that the School of Happiness didn't have room. Aller? Go? You're in! Max shouted. They were all looking at him, waiting for a whoop of joy, a word of thanks, a smile. But all Ahmed was able to do was hide his face in his hands. Why do you think that was? Overwhelming? Let's see, chapter 34. There's a new kid starting in my class after vacation, Max announced on the way home from school. That happens sometimes, Madame Pauline said absently. It was the day before Christmas break, and even Madame Pauline seemed distracted. But Max felt it was important to lay the groundwork for Ahmed's public debut. He's from Syria. Madame Pauline stopped. Max had known this would get her attention. They're letting him in now? Max felt even more annoyed than usual. It's not like he's a terrorist. How do you know? Oh, she's awful. Car lights were already turning on in the early December dusk. Madame Pauline narrowed her eyes at them as if they too might contain potential suspects. Because he's like me. He's into football and stuff. She shook her head and resumed walking. This is why the terrorists just waltz in here. Too many Europeans have this naive attitude. They're just like us, but they're not. But refugees aren't terrorists, Max argued as they turned onto a street. They're escaping terror. They want the same things we do, to go to school, to work, to have a home. At what price to the rest of us? Our values, our society, our lives? Terrorists are posing as refugees to get into Europe. I don't want to frighten you, Max, but something is going to happen here in Brussels like it happened in Paris. When somebody starts with, I don't want to frighten you, they're about to frighten you, right? She's terrible. Such a bigot. Max wished he could tell her she was just being paranoid, but he knew that she wasn't the only one still worried. The reason they had gone to the Christmas market in Aiken was that his mother was afraid that the one in the Grand Place might be a terrorist target, but it still seemed wrong to blame Ahmed for any of this. Number 50, Albert Jonard's house was coming into view. I love the subtle references to Albert Jonard and his heroic actions during World War II. It plays in so nicely into the novel. Max wondered if Jonard had been scared. He must have known the risk to himself and his family of hiding the boy, but he'd still done it. How did they catch him? Madame Pauline's brow furrowed. Who? Albert Jonard. I mean, how did they know he was hiding someone? Oh, the Jonard story, Madame Pauline said, sounding slightly disappointed to abandon her favorite topic. Ralph was sneaking out at night to visit his parents. They were living with a couple of other Jewish families on Square Vaughan. The coincidence made Max shiver. That's at the end of the street where my school is. And hasn't Ahmed been sneaking out too? Another similarity occurred to him. Ralph was kind of a refugee too, wasn't he? Madame Pauline looked at him blankly. What do you mean? You said his family fled Germany, so they were refugees too, like the Syrian kid. That's not the same, Madame Pauline said flatly. There have been Jews in Europe for centuries. They're Europeans. Hitler didn't think of them that way. They weren't trying to blow anyone up. These people are different, Max. Ugh! She's awful. It annoyed Max that she couldn't or wouldn't see the connection. Me too. Maybe if she met Ahmed, but he was worried she'd be more likely to turn him in. So how'd the Gestapo find out about Ralph? A neighbor, a Nazi collaborator, saw him going back and forth and told. That's horrible, Max said. This is why more Jews weren't saved. Albert Jonard was exceptionally courageous. It was hard to get away with a thing like that. It's interesting that she thinks he's so courageous, but I bet if she found out Max was doing the same thing, she would not think that. Max's stomach tightened. What he and Ahmed were about to do was arguably even harder. They weren't just hiding Ahmed. They were forging his way into school. For a split second as they climbed the stairs to his house, Max wondered what they had done. There were so many lies to keep straight, so many people to fool. Just the other day, Claire had said he should get checked for tapeworm because he kept raiding the kitchen at night. But Ahmed had to go to school. Max had promised him. There was no turning back now. So I'm going to read one more chapter in this session, chapter 35. Early in the morning of Monday, January 4th, in the pitch black darkness, Ahmed scaled the garden wall and dropped into the neighbor's yard. I'm surprised the neighbor has never seen him do that. Don't you think that's weird? His eyes stung with exhaustion. He'd barely slept, but at least it'd been easy to wake up early and change into one of Oscar's old uniforms. As he raced across the yard to the front gate, his backpack rattled softly with the school supplies Farah and Max had bought him. He kept an eye on the neighbor's house, but it remained dark. Past the School of Happiness at the end of the block was a small square. Trees ringed the side closest to the school. Ahmed took cover there, crouching in the shadows. Through the patchwork of leafless branches and clouds, he could see a few stars. Must be really early. Nori, Jasmine, he whispered, I'm going to school. Did one of the stars wink back at him? Or was it just his imagination? On the other side of the square, he could hear the hum of cars, the brakes of a bus, the occasional honk of a horn. Traffic was picking up. Long minutes passed, and more noises struck up out of the orchestra pit of darkness. The tinkle of a dog's leash, the crash of a glass bottle in a recycling bin, the clack of footsteps and the murmuring of voices. As the night sky paled, kids began to trudge past the square. The little ones were with their parents, but some of the older ones walked by themselves or in groups, their shoulders slumped beneath backpacks. It was time. Ahmed took a deep breath, then slipped into the stream of kids heading toward the School of Happiness. No one paid any attention. He was just another kid making his way to school. Being ordinary had never felt so special. You know, I bet when we go back to school, and we will, I bet it's going to feel amazing. And it's such an ordinary thing that we always took for granted, right? But I think it's going to feel really special when we finally get to go back. Ahmed surged toward the open door. Standing sentry were two young women, aides, whose job Max had said was to make sure no strangers slipped into the school. Ahmed was sure to attract their attention. They had never seen him before, and he was much bigger than most of the primary school students. But he and Max had come up with a plan. Ahmed checked his father's watch, then bent down to tie his sneaker. At 8:13, a shoe grazed his heel. Ahmed looked up at Max without recognition. Sorry, Max said. Pardon. Ahmed jumped to his feet. You speak English? He asked. Yes, Max said, pretending to look surprised. I look for my new class, Madame Legrand. That's my class, Max exclaimed. Are you the new kid, the one from Syria? I love what good actors they are. They're so cute. Ahmed almost laughed at Max's overacting. Yes, I am Ahmed. Max grinned. Max, he said, come on, I'll take you. He grabbed Ahmed's arm and whisked him inside. Bonjour, madame, he said to one of the aides, then pointed to Ahmed. Ahmed et vous? New. The aide smiled at him. Bienvenue, Ahmed. Welcome. It was a word Ahmed had seen in the French books he'd been studying, but this was the first time someone had said it to him. He smiled back. Merci. Merci, madame, Max gently corrected. He waved Ahmed after him, squeezing through the crowded passageway into the courtyard. Ahmed looked around in every direction, trying to take it all in. The language, the clothes, the faces of the other students, all were different than back home. But the feeling of being lost in a confusing swirl was one he was used to after 6 months in Europe. At least here, at school, they were universal rules he understood. A football flew through the air toward him. Ahmed instinctively trapped it. Pas mal, shouted Oscar from across the courtyard. Not bad. Ahmed slipped off his backpack and dribbled the ball around. He hadn't played football since he'd left Syria, but his favorite moves came back easily. He could feel eyes on him and kids watching. A boy he didn't know tried to kick it away, but Ahmed dribbled the ball diagonally, then faked him out. There was an appreciative murmur from some of the other kids. A bell rang, and everyone scooped up their bags and scurried toward a door off the courtyard. Ahmed's audience was gone, but he knew they had noticed him, and it felt good to be noticed, not as a refugee or a potential terrorist, but simply as a good footballer. He had nearly forgotten this about himself. After his father died, being good at football had hardly seemed important. But at school, the skill counted for something. He counted for something. Madame Legrand didn't seem particularly happy about having another non-native French speaker in the class. She sat Ahmed all the way in the back at a desk that smelled faintly of musty old sandwiches. But Ahmed didn't care. The desk was his. He neatly stacked his new notebooks and folders inside it, lined up his pens and erasers, sharpened his pencils. Don't we love a freshly sharpened pencil, fifth graders? Enjoying the woody smell of lead and shavings. I gotta tell you, I'm a school supply nerd, as you know, and there's nothing I love more than new school supplies and like getting them all organized. Madame Legrand wrote something on the board. Ahmed took out one of his notebooks and opened it up to the first blank sheet. It reminded him of what he'd missed most about school, how each year you started fresh. Gone were last year's marked up notebooks, worn out pens, bent folders filled with work that wasn't always your best. What mattered wasn't who you were, it was who you could be. Wow, that's a nice thing to take to sixth grade, right, fifth graders? The morning flew by as Ahmed diligently copied everything on the board. Even though he didn't understand most of it, it felt good just to write in his notebook to decipher later. Math required no translation, and neither did the gentle string of words that Madame Legrand said to him as she checked his work. Her praise made him glow from the inside, like a house that had been waiting for someone to turn on the lights. I love that descriptive language. Let me read that again, fifth graders. Her praise had made him glow from the inside, like a house that had been waiting for someone to turn on the lights. Oh, that gives me such a warm feeling. Lunch returned him to a state of confusion. I get that. He had no idea where to sit. Max had warned that there were assigned seats, so he just stood around until an aide directed him to a table where he knew no one. He had just started to unwrap the soggy peanut butter sandwich Max had packed him when Farah appeared, trailing the aide behind her. Farah dragged him to another section of the cafeteria where she filled up a tray with soup, vegetables, potatoes, and pudding and handed it to him. Then she pointed him to an empty seat at her table. He found himself surrounded by girls. This might have unnerved him were it not for the flavorful steam rising up from his tray that was making his stomach rumble. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a full, hot meal at a table. He dove in, forgetting all about the girls. Only when he had scraped clean his soup bowl and plate and was stuffing the last of the pudding into his mouth did he look up and notice them staring. He stopped mid-bite, put down his spoon, and daintily wiped his mouth with his napkin so they wouldn't think he was a complete savage. At recess, he was immediately drafted into a game of football. There was no invitation, not in words anyway, just the ball rolling toward him, the shouts of kids he didn't know, the arrangement by some prior order into teams. Despite the chill, he found himself sweating. His breath came hard. He was out of shape after months of mostly lying around the cellar, but it felt good to run. He found himself calling out names, hearing his own, Ahmed, Ahmed. At first, it was just Oscar shouting for a pass, but then he heard other voices. It was like a dream, with Max on the edges cheering as if each goal Ahmed scored was his own. Back inside the classroom, some of the boys called him by name. Madame Legrand pulled him aside and gave him a book of French verbs, writing down the pages he should study. She seemed to have decided that he was worthy of her attention. Aren't all kids? She also handed him a sheaf of forms, pour to maman, including the card his mother had to sign so he could walk home alone. Ahmed obediently nodded. Too soon, it seemed, the bell rang and everyone gathered up their books and bags and lined up in the hallway waiting for Madame Legrand to lead them down to the courtyard. It was fortunate that Ahmed was last because as they rounded the ground floor landing, it was easy for him to peel off the line unnoticed and dart into the hall. He found the janitor's closet at the end of it, unlocked, as Max and Oscar had said it would be, and slipped inside. On this first day without the signed card, he couldn't just walk out by himself without an aide stopping him. Boy, they thought of everything, right, fifth graders? He knew he'd have to wait a long time. According to Max, the school didn't close till 6 p.m. when the aftercare program ended. The closet smelled like wax and cleaning supplies, but at least it was warm. He squeezed himself into a corner behind a row of buckets and mops, put on a headlamp-style camping flashlight Max had given him, and began to study the book of French verbs. He recopied his notes, looking at the words he didn't know in his dictionary, then made a list of words to memorize. He carefully filled out a math worksheet. The work, the simple task of it, kept him calm. Hard work will do that, right, fifth graders? 2 hours later, he had nearly finished it all when he heard footsteps outside. Ahmed switched off his headlamp just as the door, oh my God, flew open. A small woman in a white uniform swung a bucket and mop into him. He stifled a yelp. She turned around, wedged a cleaning product onto a shelf. Ahmed tried not to move a muscle. She turned on the light. If she turned back toward him, she would certainly see him. But with a mutter, she turned it off and closed the door behind her. Phew. It took Ahmed several minutes to stop shaking. He was almost certain she hadn't seen him. It was a good thing he had been sitting down. But what if she came back? For the next half hour, he sat in the dark, afraid to turn the headlamp back on. A sliver of light allowed him to make out the hands of his father's watch, and only at 6:15 did he dare move, creeping to the door, opening it slowly, peeking out. The hallway was dark and deserted. The doors, Oscar had warned, would be alarmed. It was Ahmed himself who had come up with a solution. He scurried down the hall to the closest classroom. With the softest of thuds, he dropped out the window. A minute later, veiled by the darkness of the winter night, he scrambled over the wall. He waited by the holly bush till a flashlight blinked once in the living room window. Max's signal for all clear. But as he raced across the garden, he thought he saw a silhouette in a second-story window. The figure vanished, and he hoped it was just the drapes playing tricks in his mind. He unlocked the door and tiptoed back into the cellar. Ahmed collapsed on his mat, still shaking, but there was no question in his mind of what to do. He would be back at the School of Happiness tomorrow. What a day. Ahmed must be exhausted, fifth graders. So we'll find out what happens on day 2 tomorrow. So stay tuned and don't forget to answer the question in the drive, okay? See you, sweet kids.